I call this meeting to order. This is the 117th meeting of the Standing Committee on Finance. Our orders of the day pursuant to the order of reference of Wednesday, June 13th, 2012. Continuing our study of income inequality in Canada, I want to welcome all of our witnesses who are joining us here this morning, and I will present them all to us now. First of all, we have Mr. Stephen Richardson, Executive Fellow from the University of Calgary. Welcome. We have Professor Michael Veal, Department of Economics, McMaster University. We have from the Assembly of First Nations, the Chief Executive Officer, Mr. Peter Dinsdale. Welcome to the committee. We have from the Broadbent Institute, we have the Chair and Founder, Mr. Ed Broadbent. Welcome back to Parliament, Mr. Broadbent. From the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, we have Madame Armin. Can you help me with your last name?
Yalnizyan.
Yalnizyan. Welcome.
Thank you.
Le Conseil canadien de développement social.
From the Canadian Council on Social Development, Mrs. Peggy Taillon. Welcome. And from the Institut du Nouveau Monde, we have Mr. Michel Venn, Director General. Welcome.
Do we have from the University of British Columbia, we have Madame Nicole Fortin. Madame Fortin. It's 5:45 a.m. in BC, so she may have gone for a coffee, but
no, she was there because her coffee's on the table.
Her coffee's on the table. Okay. Well, welcome all of you to the committee. We have a large panel today of very distinguished guests, so welcome and thank you for being with us. Each of you will have a maximum of 5 minutes for an opening statement, and then we'll have questions from members. And we'll begin with Mr. Richardson, please, for your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'd also like to thank the committee for the opportunity of appearing here this morning. In my opening remarks, I will briefly provide some context for the issue of income inequality and comment on some measurements. First point of context is that income inequality is a natural result of free markets that price goods, services, and capital according to supply and demand, accounting for risk. Redistribution of income through taxes, transfers, and subsidies is the way in which governments act to reduce income inequality. Note, however, that redistribution mechanisms can have negative effects on the economy, for example, where high levels of taxation on business or skilled labor are used. Redistribution funded by government borrowing can also cause issues in terms of inequities between generations. Second point of context. Income inequality is inherently a relative concept, and measures of it in a given population show only relative relationships. For example, a rich country producing a large absolute amount of income could have a higher level of income inequality than a poor country producing a small amount of income, yet a sizable proportion of the persons living in the poor country would improve their economic welfare by living instead in the rich country. Third point of context. Determination of a correct or appropriate level of income distribution as a goal in itself is based on normative judgment, derived from an ethical or a political framework. For example, at the political extremes, certain forms of socialism have a goal of absolute economic equality, while certain forms of libertarianism will consider very high levels of inequality as appropriate. Typically, developed economies with free markets accept a position in between these extremes. Now, measurements. Though statistical or economic analysis cannot determine a correct level of income distribution, it can assist in measuring income inequality. These measurements of income inequality in a population can be used to benchmark inequality and redistribution against both historical and international comparisons. Gini coefficients are commonly used measure of income inequality in a population. A Gini is a measure of statistical dispersion. That is, the unevenness of a variable over a population, with a Gini coefficient of 1 representing complete unevenness, that is inequality, and a Gini coefficient of 0 representing complete evenness, that is complete equality. Gini coefficients in between obviously represent intermediate amounts. Now I'd like to refer to two figures that I think can be found in the materials that were handed out to members ahead of time. Could I have the first figure up on the screen just for others? Thank you. This is a chart that shows the Gini coefficients for income distribution in Canada for all families from 1976 to 2010. The data is from Statistics Canada. The blue line shows the inequality measured by Gini coefficients pre-tax and transfer. That is before any redistribution. The red line shows the reduced inequality after taxes and transfers are taken into account, which in effect shows the amount of distribution. My figure 2, which I'm not going to put up at the moment because I would use the rest of my time trying to get these two computers to do it. I'll put it up immediately after. The second figure just shows the difference between those two lines over time. Now, figure 1 indicates that post-tax and transfer income inequality in Canada that is taking account of redistribution increased during the time period from 1976 to 2010 by about 8.5% in total, but with virtually no increase in the last 10 years measured. Figure 2 will indicate that the scale of redistribution of income by government increased during the same period by about 27%. Although it did drop from its peak in 1994, the scale of redistribution has been relatively stable for the last 10 years measured. Moreover, as measured by the OECD, and this is not on the slides, the Canadian post-tax transfer income inequality for the late 2000s of 0.324 is very close to the OECD average.
Okay. 1 minute.
0.314, compared to, for example, the U.S., which is much higher at 0.378. What are my public policy conclusions? In my view, these historical and OECD benchmark comparisons suggest that the Canadian system of income redistribution is working well, and that there's no reason for public policy in Canada to target income inequality as a general issue. However, in order to maintain and improve equality of opportunity and living standards for Canadians, continuing attention should be paid to more precise targeting of existing and new policy initiatives using existing resources that can specifically assist lower income Canadians. For example, consideration could be given to reducing the phase-out threshold for OAS, which is currently available unreduced up to $69,562, and not eliminated completely until the person has an income of about $112,000 a year. Using these cost savings could increase the benefits to lower income Canadians who require this more. There are other examples, but I think I've probably used my time, so I'll stop. Thank you for your attention, and be prepared to take questions.
Okay. Thank you very much for your presentation, Mr. Richardson. We will now go to Professor Veal, please.
Thank you for this opportunity. The motion proposes an examination of best practices that reduce income inequality and improve GDP per capita. So turning to GDP per capita, Canada's recent productivity growth has been slow. In terms of output per hour, growth averaged about 4% per year until the early 1970s, but has fallen since. This century, it's averaged only 1% per year. Moreover, the gains that the economy has generated have gone disproportionately to the top of the income distribution. Between 1986 and 2010, the after-tax, after-transfer incomes of the bottom 90% of the population increased by about 19% after adjusting for inflation. The incomes of the top 1% increased by 77%. The incomes of the top 0.01% increased by 160% to about $4.7 million per year after tax. There are big policies on both the productivity and inequality fronts, and I think you'll probably hear about some of that today. But instead, I've elected to focus on just 3 smaller policy directions that might draw support from across the political spectrum. These are not silver bullets. At best, I would describe them as silver BB pellets. They're small. The first policy direction relates to the regulation of corporate finance. Randall Mork, a distinguished professor of business at the University of Alberta, argues that the Canadian corporate sector underperforms because of a low level of shareholder democracy and high insider power. He notes a Yale School of Management that concluded that Canada had the highest rate of insider trading among all developed economies. Low shareholder democracy and high insider power might contribute to high executive salaries, but even if not, a weak commitment to broad shareholder accountability makes it harder to raise money on Canadian capital markets and to replace tired management with innovators. Professor Mork suggests continued attempts to introduce national securities regulation to prevent a race to the bottom by provincial regulators. He also suggests tax disadvantageous disadvantaging shares with different levels of voting power because such shares enhance the ability of insiders to control corporations. The second policy direction relates to intergenerational mobility. Children should have a good chance of success regardless of the status of their parents. Long-run productivity growth is higher when society gets the best out of everyone, not just the best out of those who are born with relatively high incomes. The current published evidence suggests that Canada has had a high intergenerational mobility by international standards, probably due to relatively equal access to high-quality schooling and prenatal health. Provincial budget crunches may jeopardize this. Federal policy interaction with the provinces may become even more important. The third policy direction relates to taxation, perhaps particularly appropriate to talk about on April 30th. I got mine in last night. I do not believe that we currently have the evidence to be sure that an increase in marginal tax rates at the top will raise much tax revenue. Perhaps a better immediate approach is to eliminate those tax expenditures that both distort productive activity and benefit the affluent. I strongly support the removal of the Labour-sponsored Venture Capital Fund tax credit in the recent federal budget, as well as changing the dividend tax credit so that it cannot exceed the corporate tax paid in the case of small business. I would suggest the proposed study examine other measures, such as the employee stock option deduction. As former Rotman Business School Dean Roger Martin writes in his book, Fixing the Game, stock options contributed to the financial crisis by giving an incentive to corporate executives to focus on the information that the company released, not on true corporate performance. Or as Arianna Huffington somewhat harshly put it in her review of his book, we've gone from an economy based on making things to one based on making things up. Staying with the tax system, I support moving towards refundable tax credits. A small example is the Children's Art Tax Credit and the Children's Fitness Credit. Elimination of these would save $220 million for other purposes. But if they are to exist, I believe they should be refundable. As I've written elsewhere, in effect, these subsidize the participation in the arts and sports activities for children in all families, except those too poor to be subject to personal income tax, probably the only families for which the subsidy might make an appreciable difference. I thank you for your attention.
Very much for your presentation. We'll now hear from Mr. Dinsdale, please.
Thank you very much to the committee for inviting us here to make the presentation, and I'd also like to acknowledge that we are on unceded Algonquin territory and thank them for allowing us to gather here. We're very pleased to make a brief presentation, provide our recommendations to your study on income inequality and the relationship to taxation. As you near the end of your hearings on this matter, I know you're well aware of the terms of income inequality in Canada, and in particular that First Nations continue to rank very last here. In a 2010 study published by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, they outlined the persistent and growing income inequality between Aboriginal peoples, which is generally 30% lower than the median income of non-Aboriginal Canadians. At the current rate of change, the authors estimated it would take 63 years for that gap to be bridged. And according to StatsCan, in 2010, the average annual income of a First Nations person on reserve is $14,000 compared to $18,400, which is the poverty cutoff line for those same communities. In northern and remote communities, the cost of essential goods and services is at least 30% higher. So we're seeing tremendous income inequality and also gaps in opportunities. So many of our communities are facing crippling poverty and wider social implications. So the question is, how do we handle this and what do we do? To paraphrase Mr. Scott Bryson, who introduced the motion for this current study, he said, First Nation income inequality is a demographic and economic ticking time bomb. So the question is, what do we do for change? For many years, AFN has made submissions to the federal government on their budget process for needed investments in these various areas, although significant change has not yet occurred. So that's what I'd like to focus on briefly here, is the change that's required. I'd like to speak briefly on taxation issues. For First Nation governments and citizens, for which this committee has heard before, what I'm about to say will be fundamentally different. In the past 20 years of erosion, the courts are breathing new life into the tax immunity provisions of the Indian Act and how they impact our communities. The Eskazoni First Nations, fishermen's decisions of Robertson and Ballotine, as well as Bastien and Dubé cases, represent legal outcomes that we need to build on, and frankly, this is a shared success. We need to work together to ensure that the law develops in a positive way so we can achieve corresponding policy outcomes. By engaging and working with the federal government to restore fairness, predictability, and fair rendering of the tax rights of First Nation governments, they were agreed to as a part of the treaty making with this country and as a part of the go-forward solution. Another practical component addressing inequality is building instruments to assist First Nation governments in addressing their tax priorities, tax issues, and tax jurisdiction. The AFN has proposed a national conference on revenue options and generating revenue streams. There's much to be learned from other governments, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous. I'd also like to talk briefly about natural resources. In 2011, KPMG introduced a guide to Canadian mining and taxation, which specifically targeted towards potential foreign investors and partners. There's not one single reference to First Nation governments, First Nation peoples, or First Nation rights. Now, this is not an oversight by KPMG, but it shows you that the tax system, which ignores First Nation governments, whose communities these very natural resources are on, is certainly a challenge that we must work together to address. We talk about lots of examples, but I want to talk about a positive example, that of Fort McKay First Nation, is one great success story. There are only 700 on-reserve residents in Fort McKay. However, after 20-plus years of creating companies to serve the oil sands industry, they now employ over 4,000 people, both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal. Imagine if we had 100 more Fort McKays across this country. What would the income inequality be in these communities then? This past March, Fort McKay Chief Jim Boucher told the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers that the federal government has failed to acknowledge First Nation rights to resources and to have a say in how these resources are to be developed. And I quote, "Canada has not stepped up to the plate with respect to dealing with First Nations on a treaty issue basis, and it's not contributing to a healthy economic development situation." So for us, the solution appears relatively simple. 1 minute, thank you. And I'll summarize that solution in 1 minute. If Canada truly wants to benefit from the projected $650 billion in new resource-based projects, then make sure, either through tax breaks, through recognizing treaty rights and treaty jurisdictions, that every First Nation community has the opportunity to share in that prosperity. So in closing, the Assembly First Nations recommendation, how to reduce income inequality and how to best improve equality and opportunity of prosperity for First Nations and all Canadians, is to work with First Nations to bring about fundamental and transformative change. This includes a re-examination of equalization, fiscal transfers, and resource revenue sharing regimes, an assessment of taxation framework that reflects First Nation jurisdiction and supports investment in our communities, as well as targeted investments in education, literacy, and training. We can no longer allow the human and social costs to be entrenched in inequality to continue. While the solutions are not simple, the benefits will accrue us all. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. We'll now hear from Mr. Broadbent, please.
Monsieur le Président, les membres du comité.
Mr. Chair, members of committee, it's a pleasure to be here with you.
Great importance to a large majority of Canadians, and especially I note today when tax returns of all Canadians are due in. I want to make 2 points at the outset. First is that extreme inequality undermines democracy and the common good. The evidence is in. Very unequal societies do much worse, including in such fundamental terms as health and the real equality of opportunity for children. Second, I want to underscore that the level of inequality in a nation is ultimately a matter of political choice. Despite common exposure to globalization and other forces of economic change, which are real, a good number of advanced industrial countries have clearly been able to remain much more equal than others. They're all facing the global circumstances, but politically they've made adjustments to that, so, I repeat, a number are much more equal than others. Canada used to do quite well at achieving broadly shared prosperity, but changes in the job market, changes in our tax system, and cuts to social programs from the mid-1990s have pushed us strongly, I believe, in the wrong direction. As a result, Canada today has a major inequality problem. Part of the solution lies in achieving a fair distribution of market income by creating more good middle-class and unionized jobs. Another important part of the solution is to make major changes in our tax transfer system. Experts have shown us that its redistributive impact has shrunk significantly to the point that it is now one of the least fair in the OECD. Our institute says that the goal should be to reform our income security system so as to eliminate poverty and to significantly narrow the growing gap between low and higher income Canadians. This goal should be met by building incrementally on existing income support programs targeted to different age groups and by promoting greater tax fairness. The maximum level of income-tested child benefits should be raised to cover the full cost of raising children. We should significantly increase the federal working income tax benefit to support the working poor and deal with the growing reality of low pay and precarious work. I want to give credit to the government for creating the working income tax benefit, a new form of benefit here in Canada that can promote employment as the best path out of poverty. However, the current benefit is extremely modest, as members will know, and is lost completely at low levels of employment income. I believe it should be increased significantly and phased out more slowly as income rises. In addition, we should eliminate poverty in old age by raising the guaranteed income supplement. Canadian seniors on a global basis, technically, statistically, are the best off in the world right now. But we still have a number of Canadian citizens, seniors, that need assistance, and we should be providing that. Finally, a long-term goal, and this would clearly involve complex negotiations with the provinces, we should abolish welfare as it currently exists and replace it with an income support program for working-age adults delivered as a negative income tax. This approach, as members again will know, I'm sure, has been broadly championed across the political spectrum, including my once friend and colleague, different life, Senator Hugh Segal, and the late Tom Kent. Paying for change. These improvements to our income support programs can be financed by making our income tax system much fairer. We proposed a number of approaches in our discussion paper that the Institute produced on inequality. We should scale back on special tax breaks that deliver huge benefits to the very well-off, such as the exclusion of 50% of capital gains incomes from taxes and low tax rates on gains from stock options. From a functional market-based economy, I believe these are not necessary, these existing benefits. We should be looking to more progressive income tax rates and cracking down on tax avoidance. Revenues can also be gained by more broadly applying the principle of polluter pay. In summary, Mr. Chairman, concrete steps can be taken to make our tax and transfer system a much more effective vehicle for closing the growing gap in Canada between the very rich on the one hand and the middle class and the poor on the other. Priority, as I've suggested, should be given to fundamental reform of our income security system. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Broadbent. Next, we will have Madame Yal Mizian, s'il vous plaît.
Merci. I thank very much Senator Bryson, not yet, right, for bringing forward this opportunity. And I thank very much the whole process that permits us to talk about what is perhaps one of the defining issues, not only for Canada but around the world, on the future of democratic capitalism and globalization. Don't ask me, ask the World Bank what they think about rising inequality. Provocative words coming out of the World Bank is that perhaps rising inequality is increasingly threatening and undermining democratic capitalism. The International Monetary Fund, again, no left-wing pinko organization, says that the more inequality you've got, the shorter the spells of growth you've got, the more volatility you have in markets, and the less overall growth you have over a sustained period. Internationally referenced Canadian academic Miles Korak, from whom you've heard, has noted that there is a tight correlation between the degree of inequality in society and the degree of mobility, both social and economic, for the next generation, which is clearly something that violates the very principles of meritocratic societies. And if you think these trends are only happening elsewhere to other people, think again. The same things are happening in Canada. The Conference Board of Canada has warned that growing income inequality left unchecked in this country will lead to lost potential, increased costs, squandered opportunity, and potential social unrest. Those are words from the Conference Board of Canada. Data from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development shows that whereas Canada from the mid-1980s to the mid-1990s bucked the international trend towards rising inequality, since then Canada has slipped most rapidly down the international rankings from 14th place to 22nd place, from above average to below average equality, while at the same time 15 of 34 OECD nations reduced inequality. University of Toronto's Centre for Urban and Community Studies has launched path-breaking research showing how income inequality leads to people living in more rich neighborhoods, more poor neighborhoods, and fewer middle-class neighborhoods. If you think you can predict poverty by postal code, you know you're creating problems. And it creates problems for the way we raise our kids and the opportunities that are hardwired into their environment. Between 1981 and 2010, the economy more than doubled in inflation-adjusted terms, but poverty has been on the rise. I ask you to look at the first table that I've distributed for you, the percent of people with incomes below the low-income measure in after-tax terms by age group. You will notice that seniors' poverty rates are increasing, working-age adults' poverty rates are increasing, and children's poverty rates are higher today than they were in 1989 when all parliamentarians stood together and said that child poverty in a nation as rich as Canada was a travesty and it needed to be eliminated by the year 2000. It has been pretty much eliminated in Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and Finland. We know this can be done should we wish to do it. I ask you to look at the second chart that I've distributed, which shows the percentage of Canadians in low, middle, and high income classes. The group of people earning a middle class income between $30,000 and $60,000 has been shrinking over time. The group earning less than $30,000 is higher today than it was in the mid-1970s, and this is all in inflation-adjusted terms. And the group earning above $60,000 is rising. This leads to, of course, who at the top is earning the most. Professor Veal indicated that those in the top income group have seen the biggest share of income growth. I point you to my third and last chart in the presentation, which shows that the top 1% took 32% of all income gains in the decade before the crisis. That, ladies and gentlemen, is 4 times the amount of a similar period of growth in the 1960s and twice the amount of the roaring 20s. What can the federal government do? You can introduce direct income measures. We've mentioned some of these today: the working income tax benefit, refundable tax credits, enhancing the child tax benefit, the OAS or the GIS, or more sweeping reforms such as the guaranteed income. Also, improving access to EI is important for our macroeconomic strength so that we can be more recession-proof in future. If you don't choose to do direct measures, you could indirectly support the provinces and territories, 8 of which have committed themselves to poverty reduction strategies. The federal government should support these initiatives because you seem to like experimentation at a provincial level, and the alternative federal budget has outlined how such a plan could take place. In terms of tax measures, we've talked a lot about what could be done to raise taxes, but enforcing the rules that exist requires enhancing rather than cutting the staff at the Canada Revenue Agency and following through on prosecution of tax evasions. I would recommend also that you avoid expanding the tax-free savings account and do not introduce income splitting for families with young children. Both measures, the Parliamentary Library has shown, increase disparities rather than reduce them. You can improve supports and services as you have done in measures such as Pathways to Education funding. And you can target additional revenues raised by or not foregone by alleviating the pressure on the middle and low income households through childcare, transit, housing, and post-secondary education. And can I just close by saying the most immediate concern is the temporary foreign worker program. Some changes were introduced yesterday. Pursuing a low-wage strategy is a disaster for Canada. It needs to be further revised, and strengthening the role of labour market policies cannot be stressed enough. Correlation between unionization and greater equality has been well documented, and we'll hear more about it today.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. We'll now hear from Madame Taillon, s'il vous plaît.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much. And thank you, Mr. Chair, for seating me beside Madame Smarty Pants here, because I get to take a different tact, knowing that Armin would bring forward a lot of great solutions and also help us dissect the numbers. So I'm the head of the Canadian Council on Social Development, the oldest organization of its kind in Canada, founded in 1920. Came up with the concept of EI, disability pension, and old age pension, to name a few important policies. And I want to talk about inequality from the perspective of why bother? Why? And Armin is right. This is a defining issue, and it's important, and that you are exploring it in the way that you are today. But why bother? Is it just a buzz? Is it just something that kind of came out of the Occupy movement, or is it something much more substantial than that? And fundamentally, if inequality is left to fester, it will tear apart the very fabric of Canadian society. Equality connects us. It binds us together, and it builds cohesion. And social cohesion is critical. It's not just the absence of conflict. It's the ability to move forward in the same direction with shared purpose. It is a mandatory requisite for a smaller trading country like Canada. We can only exercise our full strength through some essential level of agreement as a country. Canada must have a continuous nation-building process by furthering a genuine consensus across provinces, cultures, and languages. We require more than a passive tolerance of one another in order for us to advance our common problems and our common purpose. At the core of our Canadian idea, there has been a broad definition of success as shared progress for all citizens, measured in terms of income, opportunity, well-being, and the enjoyment of social rights and freedoms. It has been coupled with a special responsibility to ensure those who are vulnerable are not left behind. In Canada, the assumption of a common advancement has reached across political perspectives, governments, and generations. This Canadian aspiration gave expression to an underlying individual value of hard work, fairness, merit, and shared responsibility. But we are at a crossroads. We are faced with a choice: shared prosperity or increased polarity. Decades of accomplishment in support of our shared advancement has been followed by a period, as Armin and others have indicated today, of stagnation. It's stalling progress, and now that progress is beginning to unravel. Consider the following. We are running the very real risk that our children will be the first reverse generation in Canadian history, one that is less well off than anyone before it. Less well off in employment opportunity, health outcome, the environment they inherit, income attainment, the list goes on. Growing income inequality is becoming entrenched. Middle-class families are working more but not getting ahead, except by borrowing more than they have to spend. Poverty is becoming a bog that entraps people contending with life challenges or transitions caused in part by ineffective government policy. Our collective failure to grasp a sustainable development and deal with our environmental concerns puts us on the other side of our values and our international expectations. In part, this is because have we lost the will and the focus? It's a question for all of us to answer. In recent years, almost imperceptibly, Canadians have been cajoled to reduce their expectations, to accept a lower common denominator of what we can accomplish together. Individuals and families are being encouraged to look after their own interests. Economic problems are now portrayed as the result of international or global conditions well beyond our reach. Our policy choices are reduced to GDP and our so-called standard of living, regardless of the benefits that are delivered for the well-being of average Canadians. Social needs and government responses are vilified as complex, costly, and muddled jurisdictionally. We can't afford to take our social cohesion for granted. The increasing contrast between our lived reality and the country that most Canadians presume they live in means that there's a short distance between where we are today and further alienation. There's a tremendous opportunity today to forge a new consensus for Canada. Canadians are fundamentally generous and optimistic people. We still have time to exercise our enlightened approaches to major challenges, from an aging population to a shrinking labor force. to competitiveness and poverty in ways that can galvanize most Canadians to become engaged in our next nation-building process as a country. There is no magic in addressing inequality, but it does take leadership. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your opening presentation. Ensuite, Monsieur Venn.
We now have Mr. Venn, please. Good morning. I will be speaking in French. I'd like to thank you, Mr. Chair, and I first of all would like to begin by thanking you all of you committee members, for having decided to put the issue of income inequality on the order paper today, because income inequality is a subject that we can deal with only if we discuss the whole issue of income. Income inequality pertains to health, educational inequality, lack of access to culture, to information. Income inequality is the result or the cause of various inequalities that we experience in society. Inequality of opportunities. My organization, the Institut du Nouveau Monde, has a mandate to bring citizens to the table to take an interest in societal issues and debate issues. My organization is not an advocacy agency. We defend democracy. And what you're doing here today is to discuss publicly here in Parliament a subject that is very important to all of society. The next topic that we will be looking at as an institute in terms of public debates, and this will be taking place over the next 2 years. We work in Quebec, but we'd be delighted to broaden this discussion to cover all of Canada, is social inequality. Why have we chosen to look at social inequality? First of all, everyone is saying, and it's already been talked about this morning, we've made references to the Davos Forum, I've talked about the OECD. Everyone, with the exception of some economists, state that the whole issue of growing inequality is counterproductive. There will always be inequality. There has always been, there always will be. But the growth rate of this inequality in the world is threatening peace. It's threatening economic growth. I'm not the one saying this. I'm not an economist. But we have heard this, and we've heard about this, read this, in all kinds of economic papers, including The Economist. We've gone beyond the threshold where inequality is productive. You know, inequality is good to a certain extent in the sense that it can motivate people to do better. But we've got to the point where the inequality is so big that it's only 1% to 3% or so rich, and that has a spin-off effect on people who are not in that area. So the difference between those who are rich and those who are not is no longer something that's going to be productive. It's not going to create jobs. It's no longer a factor to motivate people to invest in their country. So we're at a point where the level of inequality that is counterproductive. So we have to be aware of this. The second reason why I'm so pleased that you're talking about this issue is that the main problem with inequality today is our refusal to talk about it. It's almost like it's a taboo issue. It's as if we're saying, oh, that's okay. There's always been unfairness in inequality. I heard someone say just the other day, well, yes, I've always heard that. Well, there'll always be rich. We just have to be like them. As if that were easy to do. As if it were even possible. It isn't. So this is a taboo issue. It's almost as though we're ashamed to talk about. And one of the roles that you have as elected officials is to put subjects on the order paper that are very important, even if they are taboo. Why? I'd like to make a distinction here. I'm not talking about the fight against poverty here. I'm talking about the whole issue of inequality between the wealthiest, and not only with the with the poorest, but with the middle class. The fight against poverty is extremely important. We all agree with that. We don't want to live in a country where people are living in misery. It's against all of our values here in Canada. We can't tolerate people living in misery. And we've adopted policies that have to be enhanced. We know this. reports are constantly coming out showing that our policies are not effective in the fight against poverty, and we have the means to do something about this. That's one thing. And fighting against poverty will, in fact, reduce inequalities. But reducing inequalities will assist in this fight against poverty. And I get to the nub of the issue now. Why is it important to look at inequality? Aside from the whole issue of ethics and aside from the whole issue of, well, everybody should have the same equality of opportunity. No, this is in addition to that. Inequality hurts our economy. Why? If we want to have strong, stable growth in a country, we have to have a strong, stable middle class. Why? They're the consumers. They're the ones that are working. They're the ones that produce the goods and services. They purchase. I have 1 minute remaining? Oh, I thought I had a minute. I'll conclude. So we have to have policies that ensure that we have this stability and this strong middle class. Some avenues have been proposed. We're saying that we have to continue this debate, and I'd like to leave you with one recommendation, in addition to the ones that have already been made. You have to continue with this debate throughout the country. This is a new subject. This is a new concern, and keep up this work. Thank you, Mr. Venn.
Professor Fortin in British Columbia, thank you so much for being with us here this morning, especially I know it's 3 hours earlier for you in BC. But we welcome your 5-minute opening statement, and then we'll go to questions from members.
Well, glad to be here. C'est un plaisir pour moi d'être ici.
Very pleased to be here.
On a recent paper on Canadian wage inequality in Canada. So as others have said, it's important to note that the changes in income inequality in Canada have been different from changes in the United States, where the change were larger, happened earlier, and resulted in greater gains at the top than in Canada. Second, as was already mentioned, the Canadian fiscal regime does somewhat lessen the blow of increasing inequality. In 2009, the inequality in the after-tax and transfer family income was 28% lower than the before and after-tax and transfer family income inequality. Nevertheless, given the tension between redistribution and economic growth, it's important to consider the economic force that are behind the changes and whether they can be addressed directly. So to understand how these forces work, we have to note that in the 2000s especially, the Canadian experience with wage inequality has been one of wage polarization. So when we're talking about wage polarization, we're talking of a situation where the wage of the median worker, and here I'm talking mostly of the median male worker, is not improving as much as those at the bottom or at the top. So the 2000s, the real, meaning after inflation, hourly wages of the median man has increased by 5%, while the wages of the man at the top, 90%, have increased by 12%, and those at the bottom by 9%. So that being said, in terms of the Canadian post-recession experience from 2009 to 2012, we have seen decreasing wage inequality, and this is by contrast with the U.S., where wage inequality has continued to increase. So what are the driving forces behind the difficulties of the middle workers? So they're usually attributed to two forces: declining unionization rates and technological change. So in Canada, the decline in union male coverage has been quite substantial, from 47% in 1980 to 25% in 2012. And the reason why declining unionization rate do contribute to the polarization of male earnings is that the union premium is highest in the lower middle of the wage distribution. Now, technological change is also thought to adversely affect mostly these routine, the male-dominated jobs that are in the middle of the wage distribution, these wages on the plant floor. Let's note that these forces apply less to women because they are more likely to work in the wider public sector, including the health and education sector. So women have fared generally better against these winds of changes than men. However, there remains a gender gap. So in terms of some of the policy options that work with these forces, many of them are of provincial jurisdiction. They would include the support for public education. Most of the time we talk about higher education, but it's also important to have policy to foster high school completion. When we're talking about exclusion, we're usually talking about individuals who have not completed high school. Support for minimum wage in an appropriate range is among the policy tool to be thought about, and support for collective bargaining. So as I noted, Canada has performed relatively well in terms of generating new university degrees. However, it's important to note that not all carry the same prospect of high-paying jobs. So in a changing environment, information relative to the different prospect of the different degrees, I think, is quite important. Raising minimum wage is a tool that can help reduce inequality at the very bottom of the wage distribution. However, because there are limited spillover, it's not a very effective overall tool. Moving in the direction of a policy environment that is more supportive of unions, especially in terms of the procedure governing union certification, is one option to be considered. So let me conclude by saying that, as many others have done before me, that while growth-oriented economic policies such as encouraging trade and deepening investment in new technology may provide the basis for economic success for future generation, these policy may also have the effect of exacerbating inequality, and this should be kept in mind to continue to get public support for such policies. So this concludes my remarks.
Okay. Thank you very much for your presentation, Professor Fortin. We will begin members' questions with Ms. Nash for a 5-minute round.
Thank you. 5 minutes after all those wonderful presentations. It's a bit challenging. Let me begin with an issue that Mr. Venn raised, which is that, of course, we need to eliminate poverty and have measures that can do that. We've heard many of those today. But what about the stagnating incomes of the middle class? And my question is, most broadly, where will the middle class jobs come from? And specifically, can you give some examples in countries that have so far reduced or resisted this widening inequality? Other countries that have managed to maintain a strong middle class. What measures have they done to do that? And where are the good middle-class jobs that young people aspire to in those countries? And it's a broad question. I'll ask it to Ms. Yalnizyan, Monsieur Venn, and Madame Fortin.
I don't need to touch this.
No, they'll operate it for you.
Thank you for the question, Ms. Nash. Good middle-class jobs can come from anywhere. What we've seen around the world is that whether you're talking about IT, high technology, information jobs, or resource-based industries, it depends on how you treat the environment for labor relations. And if Canada has been pursuing a low-wage strategy for several decades now, we have an unusually high proportion of low-wage jobs. And, you know, income inequality doesn't fall from the sky. We look at one another and we value each other's work. We say that's normal that that guy gets that much and that person gets that much. So there's a kind of social and cultural consensus around the value of different forms of work, which is why I have pointed out the importance of unions in many of the jurisdictions in which growing inequality has not occurred, and in fact has been reversed. There has been a strong union component because that's actually the countervailing voice to the growing strength of employers everywhere around the world. Especially in the wake of the recession, there's been growing corporate concentration. If you cannot negotiate on an equal playing field and have some kind of collective strength, it will naturally flow. The more of the rents from this process will flow to the employers and to the property owners. You also asked the question about what these nations are doing that prevent the middle class from stagnating. And let me run a thought experiment on you. What if we had no reduction in income inequality at all, but we improved people's access, whether they're low, high, or middle income households, to transit, to more affordable and accessible high-quality childcare that prepares kids for learning readiness, to better public school education and high school completion, of more affordable housing. All of those things will improve our quality of life and create a richer middle class. So I think we can do this.
Thank you. Monsieur Venn?
Oui, si vous permettez, accompagné de mon collègue Nicolas Zorn, qui est le chercheur qui a construit le dossier que nous avons monté concernant les inégalités sociales et l'ensemble de ces questions. Je vais lui demander de venir prendre ma place pour répondre à votre question et aux suivantes. Nicolas.
Merci beaucoup.
Oui, bonjour, messieurs, dames du comité. Le problème avec le revenu de la classe moyenne, on l'a vu, c'est une polarisation en partie.
Can you hear me? Okay. Everything's all right. The polarization is due to a fewer less unionization and higher competitiveness. The tragedy is not losing the job, but it's the fact that you can't find another one. And when people are not able to get back into the job market, it's not because the market is so competitive. The problem lies with the fact that the people are set aside, abandoned by this market, and the longer they're out, the more difficult it is to get back in. And there's also an issue with access to education. Public daycare systems also fit into the equation. The problem is that economies are more competitive. It's that the sharing of the risk for this greater competitiveness is unequal. For someone who loses a job and takes a few weeks before finds another, and someone else might have to wait 2 years, well, may even give up, well, that's where the tragedy is.
Dan, just very briefly, if you could respond to that question.
In routine jobs that have been displaced. It's good to hear that those who are doing very well have been able to recycle, many of them in IT jobs and so on. So there is possibility there. Of course, the lowest performing will move to service jobs, which are lower paying. Many of those service jobs, though, are less prone to issues of outsourcing, so can resist some of these winds of change that we've been talking about. Economies such as Germany, which is built on the exportation of machine tool in a quite large part, has performed relatively well. However, there's been some polarization of earnings, even in the countries where apprenticeships and training of skilled workers is very important. So there's a sense in which, a diversified approach, but continue to train workers to perform more technology-oriented jobs, I think, is a way of the future.
Okay, I'll just point out to all of our guests here and all colleagues, like, members have 5 minutes of time, so it's a very short period of time. It goes by very quickly. If we could just ask everyone to be as concise as possible, we'll go to Ms. McLeod, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for some great presentations. Being as it's tax day, I heard a few comments in terms of the tax system, and I just want to make a note as the Parliamentary Secretary for the National Revenue Agency. Certainly our goal is closing the tax loopholes. We've made significant progress. There's certainly more to go in terms of tax evasion, offshore tax havens, and the CRA staffing. We actually have 400 more auditors than we did in the past. So where we've looked at reductions, of course, I think probably most people have electronically filed. So really we are trying to refocus our resources to actually do exactly what you've said. So I just wanted to certainly make that comment and not leave it unresponded to in terms of we recognize how important it is to have a tax system that's fair to all Canadians. My starting of my questions, though, will be for Mr. Richardson, and certainly I appreciate in your article some observations on the concept and measurement of income inequality. You state that income inequality is a relative concept. We've heard from other witnesses who've also said that looking at a single group as a snapshot in time and doesn't actually look at absolute level. And I'll quickly, I've watched a number of young adults, friends of my children who have graduated from high school, graduated from university. There's certainly, many of them are enjoying life right now. They're certainly not in a high income level, but they're, I anticipate that will change over time. So can you elaborate, does a single sample group give us a true picture of the real economic conditions? And just talk a little bit more about your graphs.
Thank you for the question. I think the point's fairly straightforward in that a country like the United States or Canada could have a very high level of income inequality, and yet people at the middle or even the bottom of the income scale would be in absolute terms more well off economically than someplace that had a very equal distribution, maybe someplace like Cuba, which is very equal and very poor. It doesn't mean that income inequality is not an important concept in Canada, so I'm not intending to demean the idea or the importance of it. I would note, however, also, I don't know if it's possible to flick that first slide back on, and I apologize to Nicole Fortin if it blocks out her presence just momentarily. But this point goes to the question of overall growth, overall economic growth, and overall income levels. And there have been a number of comments about the growing inequality gap. Well, actually, those are the numbers. If you look at the red line, there is no increase almost in the last 10 years in inequality. In fact, the actual percentage increase in the last 10 measured years, according to StatsCan, I don't make this stuff up, I just use it, it's 0.4%. Now, if the rich are getting richer, which may be the case, something else has to be happening as well to result in not having an overall increase in inequality. And that means some other people in the income scale have to be doing well also. So the fact that there is greater growth in some parts of the income scale may raise some issues, but it looks from the overall data that Canadians in general, and as I think Madame Fortin mentioned as well, really doing a lot better than some other countries, and particularly the U.S.
Okay. So I see that you're using the Gini coefficient. I understand that's a fairly common tool. It can, obviously provide us with valuable information. What are some of the sort of lacks or is there issues with the Gini coefficient as a measurement tool?
Yeah, there are lots of issues with the Gini as a measurement tool, although it's not clear there's a better one. The other tool that's been used that I'm familiar with is that in StatsCan, there's been work by Furnett, Green, and Milligan using, instead of the labor surveys and types of data that's used in the Gini coefficient, they have used income tax data and related materials. They've written a couple papers. Their last one was, I think, in 2009. I have the reference if anybody wants it. But they have indicated that they think perhaps the Gini coefficient, to some extent, understates the effects at the two ends of this income spectrum. However, when they did their results, they really aren't significantly different than what you're seeing here. And in fact, they've only done them through the year 2000.
And Any comments regarding mobility, and is there any good tool that looks at mobility?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on that, and I don't know, maybe Michael Veal would like to comment on that. But mobility is a very important issue because, again, even when you look at increasing or stable inequality, when you look at income distribution, we don't know it's the same people at the high end all the time. It may be people who are there once and then gone because they've had some large realization. So mobility is an important issue. I can't give you too much detail, but I don't know, Michael.
I think we have two who want to comment. Again, we're running very short on time. I have Ms. Fortin, then I have Mr. Veal, please.
Okay. Ms. Fortin? Nicole?
Is only one tool to describe wage inequality. It does put actually more emphasis on what's happening in the middle. So to the extent that we're concerned about people at the top getting an increasing share over time, they're not necessarily describing that phenomena. So I've provided some charts in the brief that I've given that show alternative ways of describing that. They're mostly graphical in nature. In our discussion paper, we also talk about the role of income mobility. That is the idea that from year to year, a person's income may vary, and what impact it could have on wage inequality, whether it could help. And basically, the big facts still remain, even when we take into account the idea that from year to year, each person's income may vary.
Okay.
I'll just say really quickly, these are really long-term things. So even when you look at the last 10 years, it's correct, as Stephen Richardson said. When you look at that period, there isn't much of an increase in inequality. In fact, this is a roller coaster period. We had the dot-com bust. We had the financial crisis. It goes all over the map. So really the big increase in inequality was, roughly speaking, 1985 to 2000. And since then, it's hard to tell. But also the question was about intergenerational mobility. Of course, intergenerational mobility by itself is a very long-run thing. You're talking about how parents' income affects their children's income. It's a very long period. So the best data we have suggests that in Canada, intergenerational mobility is still pretty good.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. McLeod. Mr. Bryson, please.
Mark Carney, Governor Carney, when he spoke on this issue, said that those who say income inequality is not an issue are wrong, and those who want to make it into one of class warfare are wrong, but that the real focus ought to be on that issue of equality of opportunity. The issue of disparity between provinces is one that ought to concern us. There's a growing gap in terms of the fiscal capacity and situations of individual provinces. And to what extent does that represent a threat to equality of opportunity in terms of the capacity for provinces, for instance, to fund public education?
For me?
Yes.
Yes. I agree. I think that is where the focus should be. Of course, education, kindergarten to grade 12, is a provincial responsibility, but there are interactions with the federal government. But that is essentially the problem. In a country where people can move across the country, if you could not invest sufficiently in the education of children in one part of the country, and then they move across the country and they're not as productive as they might be, it's obviously an issue that has a national repercussion.
Zanny Minton-Beddoes, from the economics editor for The Economist magazine, said when she was in Ottawa a few weeks ago that one of the reasons why income inequality is so great in the U.S. is that education is funded by local tax base. And, of course, rich communities get great schools and poor communities get poor schools. So we could see, with a balkanization of the economic situations of provinces, something or a direction not dissimilar to that. She also said the greatest area of equality of opportunity investment to address this is investing in children. To what extent does Canada need to have a more focused approach to early learning and child care in Canada?
You have Mr. Broadbent who wants to comment. Is that who it's to? Mr. Broadbent?
I'd like to comment on both Mr. Bryson's reply specifically to that question, but also to the earlier one, and that is the whole notion of equality of opportunity. There isn't a sane adult in Canada, whatever the ideological perspective, I think, that would be against equality of opportunity. For me, the serious debate, though, is between those who see a link between equality of opportunity and substantive equality, and those who don't. And the evidence is, I think, very clear, whether it looks at the work of Wilkinson and Pickett, and I'm sure the committee is familiar with that work, Spirit Level, and Joe Stiglitz, who is a Nobel Prize winner, who's written on inequality. And the clear point I would make, but I won't elaborate because of the time, is that it becomes almost meaningless to talk about equality of opportunity, and the data supports this, unless you narrow the gaps. So kids growing up, if they don't have adequate housing, don't have early education opportunities like upper income people do for their kids in many countries, the beginning in life with serious inequality undermines the notion of equality of opportunity. I'll just make that point and pass over to what Scott's question was. I think increasing the allocation of funds for preschool learning, preschool opportunities for children is of fundamental importance. And to make a nonpartisan comment, I think the government of Ontario and its initiatives recently and of trying to deal with that issue are very progressive. So beginning with preschool children with a lot of emphasis, again, I think the evidence around the world is that that's a very important initiative to take.
Mr. Bryson, you have 1 minute, and Professor Fortin. Okay, if we can do it very briefly, Madame Taillon.
I want to reinforce. I think when I talked about inequality and dealing with inequality through building stronger communities, social cohesion, early learning and childcare do that, because obviously there's huge benefits. Lots of evidence to support the benefits to kids. Put kids in school earlier. Full day kindergarten. As a mom of a 6-year-old, I see the benefits in my son. But the other benefit is once you're attached to a school, your family's attached to a school and they're attached to a community. So you consider a new Canadian, for example, coming in very isolated, really unsure. When their kids start school, all of a sudden they're part of a community as well. So a lot of women who are staying at home in very traditional roles, as new Canadians, very isolated, all of a sudden are interacting, dropping their kids at school, speaking to other parents. It's a huge way to build the fabric of a community and create a cohesive society.
Thank you. I'm trying to be very fair with time here, and we are going over. So, Professor Fortin, very brief comment, please.
Yes, I will simply like to mention that the big education divide in Canada is with Aboriginal communities, and so this is really, where a lot of emphasis should be placed if we're thinking that the basic building block begins with education. This is where the big gaps are.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Bryson, Mr. Hoback, please.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome everybody here this morning. Ms. Yelin, if I pronounce your name wrong, I apologize. Yelena Zian.
Yeah.
Okay. You make a comment in your tax measures in your recommendations, and it's basically avoid expanding TFSAs and do not introduce income splitting for families with young children. Both measures widen rather than reduce disparities. Can you maybe explain on why you think those are bad programs, and what's your data behind your thesis on that?
Yes, thank you for the question. The Library of Parliament in 2006 released a document, presumably on the request by the government because you were interested in these measures, showing that the distribution of benefits from these measures, the two measures combined, the income splitting was divided between seniors and young families. And that package of income splitting measures cost roughly $5 billion at that time. At that time, they said $2.2 billion went to families with young kids, and 8% of that bundle of money would flow to the bottom 50% of families. The higher up the income ladder you went, the more the benefits of income splitting accrued to very high income earners. And the bottom 50% of families in 2006 was under $60,000. So 50% of families raising kids make less than $60,000, they would get 8% of the benefit of that measure. Single parents, who are the poorest parents, would see nothing of it because there's no income to split. With respect to the tax-free savings account, the tax expenditures report that came out 2 months ago in February of 2013 noted was the first time we kind of lifted the hood underneath the tax-free savings account. It showed that people that were most likely to benefit from that measure were over 65 and high income. Though there was a quite large take-up of the program, the real benefits accrued to those with high incomes that had surpassed their ability to contribute to RRSP. So what was clearly created was an ability to expand tax-sheltered accounts. And you've probably heard from the Chartered Accountants of Canada, who have referred to this tax measure as revolutionary. It's revolutionary, sir, because it is going to create a huge hole in the public purse as time progresses.
I just find it interesting because if you go back to my constituents in Prince Albert, the tax-free savings account, it doesn't matter what age group you're in, has been viewed as very positive.
I'm sure it has been viewed as very positive because there is a general culture out there that says taxes are a burden and we shouldn't pay them. So anything you can do that communicates to people you don't have to pay taxes seems to be a winner, which is what you guys campaign on. But at the end of the day, by not taxing, by not paying for the system we've got, we're just going to be transferring the costs to the next generation. It's a deficit that we pass to the next generation like any other. And if we're not connecting enough revenues, we can't maintain our standard of living down the road.
I guess I take a little bit different approach because I look at it, when you leave that revenue with the family, let them choose how to spend it. That's better as society as a whole because they're spending up money as a family unit. You're maintaining the family as they choose. So I guess we'll differ on that and a little bit on how the benefits of that funds will flow through.
Can I just...
Unfortunately, I only get 5 minutes, so
sure.
I just want to get your logic behind that. Mr. Vail, you talked a little bit about loss of shareholder democracy, and I just kind of pull that back into the study we have here. Can you maybe elaborate on that?
Well, there's obviously an issue with accountability if shareholders do not get to have meaningful input into decisions at the corporate level. Now, I suspect in a large number of cases this doesn't make much difference. But the problem is in cases where it does make a difference, you will have some small group of insiders who are effectively controlling that corporation, and whether we like it or not, the rest of us are at some level stakeholders. And in particular, there are cases where shareholders would probably change management and end up with a new, more innovative group, and they simply can't because of the way the shareholding is structured in that particular entity.
And then you also made a comment about a national securities regulator. So you feel that would be one way to stop that process, or to stop that?
Well, at the moment, somebody starting a corporation in Canada can choose their regulator. And it may be that they choose regulators who are not as careful as I would expect a national securities regulator to be.
Okay. You also talked about intergenerational opportunity, and I believe you talked about the benefits or how Canada is doing so well in that. It doesn't matter what generation you're born into, those opportunities are there, whether it's education, health. Can you maybe expand on that?
Okay. That is, of course, a problem with data, because what we know is what happened to a previous generation. We don't really know what's going to happen to the current generation, right? And so it could be that intergenerational opportunity is deteriorating, but we just will not be able to record it in the data. But Canada, if you think about essentially the previous generation, and this is work by Miles Korak, who you've heard from, that work tends to say that Canada does as well in intergenerational mobility as other countries which have much more equal distributions of income than we do. And this is why I emphasize the threat that comes through provincial government deficits in a lot of the provinces, because they are the deliverers of education, and it matters to them.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Hoback. Monsieur Caron, s'il vous plaît.
Bonjour. Merci à tous.
Good morning, and thank you for your wonderful presentations. I don't have enough time to ask everyone a question. Mr. Richardson, I'm going to set aside the graphs because they can be misleading, but I would like to go back to the figures you presented. You said that the problem is relative and that if the Gini goes up, it's not all that serious because the redistribution factors have not decreased so much. So relatively speaking, that's not so bad. But when I look at the figures since 1994, whether we're talking about family income or whatever, there have been very little change before taxation and transfers. But there is a big difference in the Gini, an increase, rather, after taxes and transfers since 1994. That's about 10% for both cases. And I'd like to draw a correlation to that. The redistribution factor has gone down by 20% during that same time frame. So am I mistaken in believing that if you look at the figures since 1994, the redistributive factor of Canadian policies has really gone downward, which has led to greater inequalities after transfer and taxes?
Absolutely correct in your interpretation of the data in terms of the redistribution. Redistribution went up hugely from 1976, and particularly during the 1980s and into the early 1990s. Around 1994, it peaked, and there was a reduction in the scale as a proportion of the amount of that can be redistributed or that is redistributed after 1994, though that has leveled out over the last 10 years. And I think the reason, just historically, I'm not making any comment in favor or against it, but I think the reason that that happened was that the redistribution in the late 1980s and early 1990s was being funded by deficit financing. By the government, and in particular by borrowing by the government. And Canada reached a fiscal crisis around 1995, 96, and there was definitely a cutback of transfers to provinces and presumably some of the services that are involved in redistribution. And that did have an effect on reducing redistribution, though, as I say, it's been pretty stable since then. And it's a question of whether you think that getting back to that would justify doing so by government borrowing. I don't think that's a good idea because it's unfair to future generations. That takes you back to what do you do and how do you fund it.
But
in the long run, it's the families in general who have paid for this fight against the deficit back in the 1980s. But on the other hand, the impact of the measures chosen by the government at that time and continued by this government put us in a situation when there's less redistribution. And after taxes and transfers, the Gini, inequality of income rather, has increased. We can make that conclusion.
It did increase from the high point of equality and redistribution prior to 1994, as I said.
J'aurais aussi une autre question, en fait.
I also have another question. So the statistics you have, they go back to 2008. So we don't really see the impact of the latest crisis. I think the OECD doesn't have figures that pertain to the time period after 2008. I'd also like to know redistribution. The measures that we have in Canada are through taxation or social programs such as employment insurance, OAS, and so on and so forth. If we head in a direction where we want to decrease taxes, where we want to have income splitting, which was mentioned, I believe, by Mrs. Yeliazin, if we also decrease transfers for EI or OAS, as the government recently announced, what impact will that have on the redistribution factor and income equality?
Depends on exactly what's done. For example, with taxation, as we were discussing, it's possible, and in fact recommended by the OECD, and I think Michael Veal referred to it, that even if you want to increase tax revenues, in order to do more distribution. The better way to do that is not by raising marginal rates, it's by removing various...
La question, c'est quel sera l'impact sur le facteur de redistribution.
But what impact will it have on redistribution? The question is, what impact will this have on redistribution?
Well, tax is a factor, and programs that provide benefits are a factor, but there are also, I should just mention, very important elements outside the numbers that we've seen here that provide redistribution, and those would be medical care for Canadians, education, travel services, and other things like that.
Thank you. Merci. Mr. Jean, for your round, please.
Thank you for coming today. I'm going to deal with one of the, I think, most serious situations. But first of all, I'd like to wish our Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, happy birthday. He's 54 today. I think it's very important. One of the most important people to our economy for certain. But I do want to talk to you, Peter, in relation to what I consider to be one of the biggest issues and dramas and quite frankly, one of the best opportunities we have in Canada, and that's, of course, First Nations people. Highest rate of poverty of any group, highest incarceration rate of any group, highest birth rate or fastest growing of any group. And I think the best opportunity, because there seems to be, to my way of thinking, coming from Fort McMurray and knowing Jim Boucher, used to live with my brother back in the 70s when he was just a young fellow. But definitely a very successful situation, $130 million or $133 million in sales last year. But it's not an unusual story. In fact, there's a true correlation. My nephew, Dwayne Jean, who is also a treaty Aboriginal from Janvey, I think you know him, he's just started a business 2 years ago. He just told me, I was pinning him, he did $2.5 million last year. This year he's already at $5 million. It's only halfway through. And he's just got a company that has 40 employees and does water trucks and sumping and amazing success story. He's got $2 million in the bank. This is a guy that spent 10 years in and out of jails, Drumheller in particular, but tremendous success over the last few years. Why? Because there seems to be a true correlation between successful Aboriginal communities and resource development. Would you agree with that?
I think you're seeing an example where it works. I don't think there's enough of those success stories across the country.
And that's what I want to concentrate on, is what works, because it does work.
Absolutely.
I mean, if you see some other people, I'm from West Bank originally, and if you look at what's happening down there with the Louis family in particular and the Soyuz, they talk about capitalism, hard work, and self-reliance. This is a model that can work. It works down in southern BC. It works in northern Alberta. It's very successful. How can we get more Aboriginals to work? How can we do this? Practical solutions.
Yeah, well, I think it's about fair and equal partnerships. I think that would be the starting point. Okay. I mean, First Nations are not anti-business or anti-development. They're pro-successful partnerships. And I think you're seeing examples of where those occur. There's too many examples, whether it's the Ring of Fire. We could talk about De Beers Mines in some locations. We can talk about any number of examples across the country. Where there are challenges with the nature of the impact benefit agreements, with how the community actually benefits. It's not enough to come in, take a X billion dollars of resources in the year, hire 40 people from the community, and call that the relationship.
Now, would you call Syncrude's policy, where they have a mandatory policy of 15% Aboriginal employment, that's their goal, and they've been working on that goal for over 10
I
years?
can't speak specifically about that. I haven't had enough time to go through. I think it's also more about ongoing engagement, about developing not only the relationship on that particular location. It's also about the subsidiary business. It could be a % share in the actual operations itself. What's the ongoing engagement? You know, I remember talking to one of the resource extraction companies about they were celebrating the number of particular wells that they have developed in particular First Nations to extract oil. When pushed to say, why is your company doing this now? It was all about the duty to consult at the time. It was all a rights-based argument that took place. They weren't doing it prior to that. And I think we need better consultation and accommodation policies and engagement. I think we've got to work together on that, though.
Agreed, and I think it's going that way. It certainly has moved that way. Wouldn't you agree? It's gotten a lot better in the last even 10 years, I would suggest.
Well, certainly in the past 10 years. I think we have a long way to go to get to that $650 billion potential that Canada has.
I don't know if you're aware of it. We've actually signed over 90 treaties with First Nations in the last 7 years compared to the previous 13 years, which I think 8 in total. So do you see that as being part of the challenge and part of the solution?
Absolutely. Both treaty implementation of those existing treaties, because there are some challenges to the treaties as they've been signed, as been implemented, and ongoing comprehensive claim reform to sign new treaties are absolutely essential to, and that was in part the meeting we had January 11th, the Prime Minister, to follow up the Crown First Nation gathering from the year before, was on those very things. So I think you have a long way to go in comprehensive claims reform and treaty implementation, but that is absolutely part of the solution moving forward.
Do you see that the real success that we can have is the actual correlation and partnership between natural resource development in a sustainable way and utilizing those First Nation partnerships all over the North for that particular resource sector.
Yeah, I mean, but it's within a broader bundle relationship between the Crown and First Nations.
Absolutely.
And I think natural resources are a part of the fiscal relationship that exists. Right now it's primarily contribution agreement based as opposed to this kind of governance
And
model.
that tripartite agreement between industry, First Nations, and the government of
where
Canada.
they work, absolutely.
Great. Thank you very much, sir.
You've got another 30 seconds if you want.
Mr. Chair, I keep seeing those two fingers together, so I get nervous when I see that. But I have tons of questions. I did want to talk a little bit about the dividends checks. And do you see that as being a successful model? First, you know what happens with Mackay. I mean, I think $20,000 to each member last year in a dividend check because they had such a successful year. Do you think that kind of thing to spread it out to the community members is a successful model?
I think you have to balance out, individual per capita distribution between what's retained in the communities. I think I've heard others talk about the economic advantages to address income inequality of schools and daycare and public infrastructure. A lot of communities don't have schools. They don't have paved roads. They don't have wastewater treatment facilities. I think so. Per capita distribution certainly is one model. I think there's other more community infrastructure building that would be. Of course, each community has to make those own determinations for themselves.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Jean. Monsieur Côté, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup, Président. Aïe, aïe, aïe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to ask Mrs. Fortin a question, and then I'd like to put a question to Mr. Zalman. I would ask the other witnesses to remain silent. If we have time, we can get back to those questions after. Mrs. Fortin, I really enjoyed your presentation. There are all kinds of measures, tax measures, that are quite aggressive. Take the example of employment insurance. The PBO in his latest fiscal outlook said that the insurable rate per insurable earnings would increase by $2.03. These are measures that have an impact on the middle class and small businesses. Are you aware of any studies on women and the impact this will have on women? When you look at this measure in itself, it seems to be of limited impact, but when you combine it with other things, it's quite different. What are the general impacts, therefore, for these type of workers and entrepreneurs, particularly with respect to women? It's clear that women have a tendency to work more on a part-time basis as compared to men. So when EI measures enable part-time workers to accumulate hours and therefore access to EI benefits, well, that seems to me to be a measure that would really help them. What was your second question, Mrs. Fortin? It was about inequality and the aggressive nature of the new measures. We talked about the contribution rates for EI and the new custom rates on imports, which pertain to about 60 or so countries. This is a type of tax credits that will have an impact, particularly in Quebec. These measures will have an impact on the income after taxation. So this will be a disadvantage to those workers, clearly. As for the size of the business and inequality, the impact on business is difficult to establish. And for this reason, it's difficult to make a forecast pertaining to the measures you've raised. Thank you very much. Mr. Zom, when I look at your report, I find it quite fascinating. I don't have enough time to really go into it in great depth, but when you talk about taxation, you quote from the Piketty studies and a study by Sancheva, and stating that there's a strong correlation between the level of income and marginal rates. That's very interesting. And this observation is not simply being made by researchers alone. Perhaps you saw the letter by Warren Buffett in the New York Times, and he explained his own experience as an investor. And he said that the high rates for the wealthy was not an obstacle for those who wanted to make money. He said it was an urban legend. Would you like to comment on this? Thank you for your question. The Sancheva study came out in 2011. It says that not only is there a big correlation between those countries that have seen percentage points increase correlated with the low of the marginal tax rate. The correlation is clear, and there is no correlation between the lower marginal tax rate and the growth of GDP. So the taxation level is not what's important. It's what we do with this money. Now, going back to the correlation, the marginal tax rate has two consequences in this particular case. First of all, it puts a ceiling on income because the money, the richer people have higher savings, so it doesn't have such an impact on them as it does on the middle class. And often it has an impact on an income or money that's outside the country. And it also increases, the other impact is that, thank you very much. Very briefly, the other impact is that with a tax rate that's lower, it has an impact on pensions, because for someone paying less taxes, the advantage of someone who's be able to negotiate a higher salary without any productivity gains is higher.
And thank you, Chair. Thank you all for being here today. Mr. Broadbent, it's truly an honor to have you here today, so I'm so happy that you're here. I do have a couple of questions for you. I'd like to pursue my line of questioning with you, if you don't mind. You mentioned in your remarks about governments making political choices, and that's what we do as a government. And our political choices in terms of the Canadian health transfer, Canadian social transfer, the health transfer going up 6% plus nominal GDP, the social transfer 3% plus nominal GDP. The provinces, we give that block transfer to the provinces, and they in turn spend it on, in terms of health, it's on health, and in social transfer, they spend on education, etc. They have not been spending all the money that we've been giving them. In fact, a lot less than what we've been giving them. Could you talk a bit about the political choices that they are making? Because we seem to be making the right choices on that front. They're making the wrong choices. Could you comment on how their choices are contributing to social inequality?
Well, all I can say is that old movies are still with us. When I was around 150 years ago in this place, we had the same issue of different governments, sometimes a federal liberal government, sometimes in the past a federal conservative government. And that is, are the transfers being used for what they were intended? And you put your finger on a very serious issue. And if I remember correctly, and I think I do, the Romano Commission recommended the big increase at that time, big increase, and it was badly needed. But he also recommended that certain reforms go with it, and in terms of driving down costs, for example, of health care, but also wanted some kind of agreement that would see the provinces actually spending where they're supposed to. As you know, our Constitution has real problems with enforcing that. I don't care about the ideological persuasion of a given federal government. Whoever the federal government is will have problems, given the provincial constitutional authority, to enforce the priorities. All I would hope for is that in a negotiating process that a mechanism for enforcement is set up. And I would go so far as to say certain conditionality should be introduced. If the province is going to get money and negotiates a certain percentage and it's coming from the federal government, then I think it should be obligated to use that money. Otherwise, don't take part in the agreement. Use the money for what it was intended. Having said that, I don't underestimate the challenge of making that happen.
Thank you. As you know, we've also increased the guaranteed income supplement by 25%, which is the largest in Canadian history. Do these initiatives by us solve the problem? No, but we're certainly moving in the right direction. Could you comment on the what happened in the 90s when the government of that time balanced the federal budget by cutting transfers to the provinces, and how that, what effects that had on social inequality?
It's a very brief answer. Disastrous.
Okay.
I mean, I think it was the biggest net cut in social programming in post-war Canadian history that flowed from that, and I think there. And if I may say so, as objective as I can try to be in this, and nonpartisan, but it's a judgment. If you look at what Mr. Clinton did in the same period, dealing with deficit problems, did he have massive cuts in social programming in the U.S.? No. Do you know what he did? He stimulated growth in the economy. He said that the real way out of this was to get more jobs, on the one hand, and he increased taxes on the rich, by the way.
Yeah.
So, and very soon, the American economy was taking off, and broadly speaking, the Canadian economy started to take off too, because such a high percentage of what we produce is exported to the U.S. market. So this is a subject of a big discussion. It wasn't the massive cutbacks in social programming that turned the Canadian economy around. In my view, it was the booming American economy, created by a different approach by Mr. Clinton, that had that effect.
I need 15 seconds. Thank you.
Very briefly.
It's very. I'd love to pursue this more with you, but two just very quick questions. One is, any regrets on this 1979 decision? Because remember, that was the 18 cent a gallon, issue during the campaign. I'm bringing down the government. And second, do you ever think of what could have been had there been an election the summer of 1987?
In the summer of 1987.
Remember, you were roaring in the polls. You were.
Yeah, I would think retrospectively we should have had it. Absolutely. When we were riding high in the polls all over the country, I think it was God was not performing correctly in Canadian history.
Thank you, Mr. Adler. Thank you. Mr. Rankin, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, witnesses. I'm going to follow up on the first of Mr. Adler's questions, not the second. And my focus is on federalism. By way of overview, I'm looking at what practical measures a federal government can take to implement measures to address income inequality. And I have the three witnesses I'd like to respond. First, Mr. Broadbent spoke of welfare reform, acknowledging it was primarily provincial. Wrote this morning in the National Post about the welfare wall and what we do about that. Again, sort of provincial issues. Professor Fortin acknowledged that education, minimum wage, and collective bargaining, mostly provincial. And Ms. Yalnesian recommended we support provincial poverty reduction measures. Again, all matters provincial. So we have this federal social transfer. And it tends to be essentially a no-strings-attached type of process more and more. Yet we have a spending power, the federal spending power, which is robust. So I'd like to ask the three of you, Mr. Broadbent, Professor Fortin, Ms. Yalnesian, what can we as federal politicians recommend to specifically address the issues I've referenced in your various presentations? Starting with Mr. Broadbent, please.
If I understand the question, I think I do. It's a lot of the recommendations that have been made around the table, including by me, are within provincial jurisdiction authority. And I am in favor of using the federal spending power, but I am also in favor of doing it in what used to be called a cooperative federalist way of working with the provinces and trying your best to get agreements for changes. And I referred that to the particular form of guaranteed income I'm saying should be a long-range goal of Canada that Tom Kent and Hugh Siegel have also advocated. I think those kinds of complex changes in social policy in Canada, on the whole, require federal-provincial agreement if we're going to maintain a kind of cooperative attitude in the country. And I don't underestimate the difficulty in achieving that. But I think federal initiatives are appropriate, even if to say, we have money, we have the tax resource as a federal government, in particular in some cases the provincial governments, some provincial governments for inequality reasons that have been raised already between the provinces don't have, and we're prepared to put up, I'm not going to name some of the programs that I mentioned, for example, are in provincial jurisdictional authority, and we would like you to cooperate. And that can be, using the prime ministerial pulpit, if I can put it that way, too, showing federal leadership in talking about the necessity of these things to build a more equal Canada and to put public pressure, if you like, on more provinces to get a sufficient number in to have effective programs.
Thank you. Professor Fortin?
2 minutes left. Minute each.
It's going to be difficult for me to improve on it. So there are some of the increase in after-tax inequality of the 1990s, as was pointed earlier, can be traced back to some cut down in social assistance, but also the removal of some surtaxes in some provinces. There's some that are coming back. For example, in BC, some of that's coming back. Now at the federal level, there remains a few tools, such as the GST credit, the child tax benefit, and the working income tax benefit, which are important programs. So a lot can be done by improving on these programs, but I really applaud the point that was being made about leadership. It seems that by bringing the issue of income inequality in the news, basically it may bring the attention to the public, to the boards of governance of some firm as to how appropriate it is to give bonuses and so on to high-paying workers. So I think these tools are within the realm of what will be effective.
It's about 20 seconds if you want to comment.
I will cede my time so that we can move along.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Rankin. Mr. McColman, please, for your round.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair, and thank you as well to the witnesses for being here. I'd like to go down the angle of the education, and in particular public policy on education. What our government is facing now and future governments will face is the fact that we're on a trajectory of being 1 million workers short within the decade of the jobs that are available in this country. And I know that's real because it's real in certain regions of the country now, having traveled with the Human Resources Committee and speaking with employers and employees and unions and whatnot on the various sides. And when you reflect on what has happened over time, over the last number of decades, I remember when I was in elementary school, we had a tech room where there was tools and there was the ability to find out if you had the aptitude to do a skilled trade. It may not have been your choice eventually, but it was there and it was available. They were available as well. The tech wing at Brantford Collegiate Institute, where I went to high school, had a full tech wing, automotive, electrical, carpentry, you name it. They're all gone in Ontario as far as I can see. For the most part, they're all gone. For the most part, at that level of elementary, and we've put a focus on it. I'm as guilty as any with 4 children, having graduated 3 of them with general BAs who were not employable when they got into the workforce and had to go back to a year of community college. So I'm painting the scenario for you. Is that progress? Is that the kind of thing that we need to reinstitute? Is matching skills with the job sets that are available to make sure, if we're talking the inequity question we are today, is it important? We all know how empowering education is at different levels. Not everyone's meant to be a university professor or a doctor or for that matter, a politician. But nonetheless, can I ask you your views on getting that right?
This is to Professor Fortin.
To Professor Fortin.
I think you rightly mentioned that many of the technical jobs now almost require some post-secondary degree. A mechanic today really uses a computer quite a lot more than before. So I think this emphasized the point that high school completion has to be an important goal of public policy, because indeed many of the skilled workers' jobs are increasingly skilled, and many of these skills are taught at post-secondary institutions.
Maybe I see Mr. Broadbent would like to weigh in here, so please.
Just comment briefly. I really strongly agree with your orientation. I grew up in a town with a high school that had the kind of what we call technical training, just of the kind you talked about, and it's disappeared too. I'm spending some time in recent months in the United Kingdom, and a big debate is being waged there. And like so many countries, they're looking at Germany as a model of where they make a distinction between formal academic training, like you had and I had probably, and technical training. And there's no low status allocated, to put it bluntly. Quite the contrary, to working class men and women who get technical skills, and they're being recognized all over, not only in Europe but elsewhere. And one of the, in addition to what's been said already, a point I would make is it seems to me an industrial policy for Canada, in the manufacturing sector in particular, might use some kind of incentive in terms of tax system to corporations and they have to really do it, to have apprenticeship training programs in the industry, which by and large, as I understand it, is the emphasis in Germany, so that we encourage our children. As you say, not everyone is, going to be a doctor, and to be a skilled worker should have the same kind of positive response for the rest of us. So a federal government, one thing it could do, it seems to me, is look at the idea of having tax policy for corporations being related to skill training.
Mr. McColman, you have 30 seconds, and Madame Yalnizyan wanted to comment as well.
Can I use my last 30 seconds? Yes. I just want Mr. Broadbent.
It's your time.
Is it fair to say that this will help this inequity gap that we're talking about at this table today, if we get the education system back to matching people with the jobs that are available?
Well, if it's done and they get the skilled jobs, and that can be. But there's a point that I made and a number of others today, is the other thing we have to address, frankly, is unionization. Germany has one of the highest rates of unions in Europe, and one of the major reasons that people with technical expertise that I don't have, that produce the data, show there's a good correlation between good, high-paying jobs and more equality and union presence. So I think we have to encourage that as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. McColman. We'll go to Ms. Glover now, please.
I'm thrilled to have all of you here, and it's interesting as we progress in this study, just the disparity between opinions on whether or not we in fact have income inequality problems here in Canada. It's mind-boggling to see how many surveys are on one side and how many surveys are on the other side, but we'll have to sort that out in the report phase. Mr. Broadbent, I would like to continue with you for just a moment. The Canada Job Grant, as you answered Mr. McColman, the Canada Job Grant was announced in the recent budget. Have you had a chance to look at it, and what are your thoughts on it? Because it certainly appears that it would solve some of the problems that you discussed with Mr. McColman.
I have not.
Okay, and that's fair enough. Thank you. How about if we look to one of the reports that you did, Mr. Broadbent, because I found it interesting, to say the least. It's a 2012 report, of course, we're familiar with. It's called Towards a More Equal Canada, and it repeatedly advocates for higher taxes as a way to solve income inequality. And so one of the quotes from the report, in fact, says the following: tax cuts have squeezed the services we already have and made it difficult to talk about expanding the social programs. Taxes are the hinge that links citizens to one another. So I'd like you to just expand on that. What tax cuts are you referring to in that quote? And I'm assuming that you would recommend that we reverse those.
Well, the tax cuts that I refer to that we, because it was a collective enterprise to produce that report, a lot of people were involved, a lot of academics across the country that contributed to it, were, I'm not going to give the statistics off the top of my head, but the general reduction in tax is going to upper income Canadians from both Liberal and Conservative federal governments. A disproportionate benefit has gone to upper income Canadians. So one measure among many that we indicated was to reverse this, to not drive tax rates up to what they were, the same level half a dozen or 10 years ago, but to consider seriously, positively increasing taxes on the richest.
So tax the rich. What are the other?
Well, let me just put it in context. It's been said by a number of people. In recent years, the top 1% have had about 30% of all the income growth in the country. So the argument is, if they've really benefited, to generalize a lot, from globalization and other reasons, disproportionate to middle class and working and lower income Canadians, then the argument is, look at restoring some of the tax rates they used to pay.
No, and I understand what you're saying. What other tax cuts were you referring to that you want to see us reverse? Because, frankly, those folks are paying the majority of taxes that pay for our social programs. I'd hate to chase them away. But nevertheless,
I don't think
it's
they're going to go anywhere.
philosophy.
Last report, and all the survey data doesn't indicate they're going to back up and move.
Okay. So what other tax cuts would you say?
Well, no, we're talking about capital gains, 50% of capital gains being exempt from taxes.
Any others? You mentioned the tax credits, for example, that you would see, and I think you mentioned in your report, too, that we should eliminate these boutique tax credits, is what you call them in the report. So what tax credits were you referring to when you made that statement?
I frankly would have to check specifically to look at the list.
Sure, we'll accept a written response to the question after the fact. The other thing you say in your report, sir, is that we should consider implementing taxes on inheritance of wealth, which pass morally unjustifiable class privilege, and significant revenues could be raised by the introduction of a financial transaction tax. So can you also clarify what taxes you're referring to in that?
Yeah, well, on the transaction tax, that's a very old idea that's coming into force. In fact, the European Union, if I remember it correctly, last week adopted it. So
how would you see it work? A financial transaction tax you would implement. How would you see that work?
Well, when you have transactions, movements of capital around, there's two purposes. When it was, if I remember, when it was first proposed by a Nobel Prize-winning economist. One is to get it's a source of revenue when you're ever these flows of billions of dollars instantly by seconds. One is to get a source of revenue
but
out
who
of
would
this.
you tax is my question. Who would you tax?
Well,
how would you have the tax? Who's it going?
Well, who's
it affecting?
Whoever is initiating the transfer.
Right.
It would be the source of taxing, and one purpose of it is to deter, and depending on how it's implemented, highly rapid and highly destabilizing flows. That's a technical matter that, other than making the general observation, I won't go beyond that.
Okay.
So that's what's in mind with the transfer tax. And I repeat, the European Union, with the notable exception, and they're not part of the euro, Britain is objecting, but the rest of the European and Western European countries have adopted that. And what was the other tax you were referred to?
Well, I think we've run out of time, but your inheritance on wealth tax.
Well, the view I had is that should be looked at. We didn't say it should be adopted, but again, if you look at European countries, many, if not most, have some form of tax like that already. So I'm saying that if we really are concerned in general about inequality, these are things we should be looking at. We didn't say they should be, and I emphasize this, all adopted. We said they should be looked at.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Glover. We'll go to Ms. Nash, please.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Dinsdale, we haven't talked much about First Nations this morning, and certainly, as you've mentioned, some of our most pressing inequality challenges are among First Nations. And you talked about a variety of concerns around taxation, around education, and certainly There's a great concern about the 30% gap between what First Nation kids on reserve get versus kids in the rest of the country. There were some measures in the recent budget around training for First Nations youth. I'd like to ask you about consultation and about discussions with the federal government and the involvement of First Nations in developing a strategy to address inequality and really poverty in many First Nations communities. Can you tell me what kinds of consultations have been taking place?
Well, I think it's a little complicated, as I'm sure you can appreciate. There's a variety of different levels that this takes place at. The primary importance is consultation with the rights holders themselves, so individual First Nations themselves. We've heard reflected from some of our constituents that notification is not consultation. Coming in and telling you're doing something does not meet whatever standards that we have out there to be seen as the standards we should strive for. We do have Supreme Court reference on the matter in Section 35. Anytime the right is infringed or we say it's infringed, that there is a duty to consult and accommodate. That doesn't mean there's a veto, but it certainly means there's a requirement to engage in those discussions in good faith. And of course, Canada endorsed the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and with that comes the free, prior, and informed consent, as well as communities as they go forward. So the question is, what consultation has taken place? I don't think we've seen the substantive consultation process yet, which ticks off all those boxes. Certainly want to acknowledge First Nations have a responsibility to engage in good faith in those consultations, but it can't be simply notification that we're going forward with this and we're interested in your opinions as we go forward with this. I think it has meant to be more iterative. As it relates to what we stated here this morning about resource development, if you're going to come into a community and extract resources from that community, there's a variety of negotiations which need to take place. I mean, those are understood, affirmed rights to those communities and those areas and those resources. So I think it needs to be much more iterative. It must be prior to them coming in. It must be collaborative. And it must end in a relationship where the nation themselves are thriving as well as broader Canadians.
Thank you. Mr. Broadbent earlier referred to the importance of a flexible federalism where we're engaged in where the federal government's engaged in negotiations with the provinces. I assume you would agree then that consultation and active negotiations need to take place with First Nations across the country as well.
Yeah. And in two notes, I just want to comment as well, as Ms. Glover commented that there's questions as to whether or not income disparity exists in Canada. We invite you to come to our communities and determine. I know you weren't saying it doesn't exist, but the debate which exists amongst academics is a very academic exercise. That yes, the rich get richer, but the poor get richer too. It's quite a gap which remains. It's quite evident in communities such as ours. And I think the way to move forward is this kind of collaborative process. And the role of the provinces, I mean, the First Nations have a unique relationship with the Crown. It's with the federal Crown. Of course, there is the province in right of the Crown, which has resources, so I think it will need to be tripartite. But First Nations, I think, rightly look to the federal government first in assertion. Things like education, which was commented as a provincial responsibility, of course, is also a federal responsibility. It's a treaty right to education, which is guaranteed under Section 35, which we need to make sure it gets maintained in those consultations as well.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dinsdale. Much bigger discussion. I'd like to share the rest of my time with Mr. Caron.
We've got less than a minute. So.
Mr. Veal.
To know what your position was on the elimination of the survey on labor and income dynamics, and what impact it will actually have on the study of income inequality in the future.
I think if you're trying to influence the economy and know whether policies are working, you need to have the best possible information. I think that was an undesirable move in that direction. Less information.
Mm-hmm. And if I got 20 seconds, I just want to conclude, Mr. Broadbent. We didn't have a chance to talk about the negative income tax. I think you might have had a better chance to get some sympathetic ears on the other side across the way if you had mentioned that the idea was conceived by Milton Friedman at the time. So that's a way to actually say that this issue is something that we can actually all study across the partisan lines.
I've often said that Some conservatives have very good ideas.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take the final round. I actually read that piece by Milton Friedman in university, although he would describe himself as a libertarian, probably not as a conservative. So there is some commonality across the philosophical divide on that. I have too many questions and not enough time, unfortunately. I did want to get into that and the working income tax benefit. And Professor Vail, I appreciate your recommendations with respect to national securities regulation, intergenerational mobility, the elimination of or the removal of labor-sponsored venture capital funds. We may ask you to come back on the budget bill, which was either this one or the next one. I did, though, want to focus my comments with respect to and follow up on Mr. McColman's remarks, especially in my area. I mean, the demand for people, skilled, unskilled, labor of all type is the number one issue I get from businesses of all sizes, small, medium, large, all come to me and say, James, we cannot find enough people, whether it's BioWare, a computer tech company, whether it's a manufacturing processing facility, which is running at 2/3 capacity, whether it's a hotel or a restaurant. All types are saying we don't have enough people. So there is a skills mismatch, which we're obviously trying to address through things like the Canada Jobs Grant. But I want to focus perhaps Mr. Dinsdale, on you with respect to the Aboriginal community, because my friends who are First Nation who have frankly succeeded, I mean, I look at them and I was sitting around with a number of them and they all either have a trade or they have university education. So I said to them, so that's sort of the key to their success is finishing university or a trade school. And they looked at me and they all said the same thing. They said, no, the key was finishing high school. The key was completing high school. So perhaps just to ask you to comment on some of the programs that are in place with respect to completing high school, things like Pathways to Education program that was the government reaffirmed its support in the last budget. Programs like this, if you could comment on that, and if there's anything else that this committee ought to be considering in terms of ensuring that kids do have that great opportunity by encouraging them to complete high school.
Well, I was going to start off by teasing you that I have non-Aboriginal friends that also do very well, and some of them are trades. But I would agree that they all as well completed high school, which would have been the key marker. But I appreciate the question, though, of course, for the graduation rates. I think the primary issue right now is the lack of a sustainable system across the country for First Nations education. We have such a disparity in funding in schools, in communities. It shocks me when federal departments try to challenge whether or not their rates are equitable on First Nations versus off reserves. Are we talking about the same things? We have access to counselors and things of that nature. There are tremendous funding disparities at its core, estimated up to $3,000 per student. And I think it's such a structural issue, it's difficult to look past it. It's got to be more than just more money. And I understand we need standards, we need measures of accountability, but we can't get beyond the basis that you have to hire teachers and have strong and effective facilities to go and actually educate kids through a curriculum. There's no question that what needs to take place. There is a process right now where the federal government is out discussing a proposed education legislation. Our hope that it's an open, you talked about the consultation process Ms. Nash asked about. It is all about not notifying. It's also about engaging and working together towards creating a system of education which is appropriate. So I absolutely agree that the education attainment is critical. High school education is critical. I think we need a collaborative process between our respective governments to help facilitate and make sure we have the best system in place for kids, because ultimately we're all striving for the same thing. Public education system where First Nation kids are graduating at the same level.
My understanding from the national chief, though, is that, I mean, a lot of his focus has been on education, which is why I addressed the question to you. And,
but that has spurred this whole discussion. Without his involvement, without his pushing, we wouldn't be where we are today.
But my understanding is the investments in Pathways to Education programs like that, with investments in this year's budget, last year's budget, a lot of them were in fact based on recommendations from him and from your organization.
I mean, I think they're all very welcomed. I don't think that's a structural change we're all driving for. I mean, I don't want to dismiss them because I think they absolutely are helpful. But we're seeking broader structural change to the relationship. I mean, I don't think those investments in and of themselves are going to result in First Nation kids graduating at the exact same rate as mainstream Canadians. It's simply not. They're important investments. I think we're looking for greater structural change to help make sure that it takes place across the country in every school. One of the simple calls we had going into January 11th meeting was the Prime Minister that there's a school on every First Nation community for those children. Imagine that, a school in all your communities. There's a school in all of your communities that those kids can access. They simply want the same chance in their communities.
Okay, thank you. That's a much larger discussion. Unfortunately, we are out of time in terms of our entire committee. I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here, your presentations, your responses to our questions. Again, Professor Fortin, thank you for coming in 3 hours earlier in British Columbia. If there's anything further you wish the committee to consider, please do submit it, and we will ensure that all members get it.
Mr. Chairman, I wonder if, in going through an old movie, permit a point of order. I was told I misinformed the committee on a certain fact by Mr. Bryson, so I want to use the opportunity to correct the record. I gave credit to the government for creating the working income tax benefit. I'm told that this was introduced, in fact, by the last Liberal Minister of Finance, but regrettably, his government was defeated. So it was brought in by the present government.
Mr. Broadbent, I'll just point out, as an experienced parliamentarian, you know that's a point of debate, not a point of order. Thank you so much. Colleagues, we will meet actually down the hall for the next meeting. Meeting adjourned.